And he argues, at least in one plausible interpretation of the text, that contingent statements about the future are neither true nor false. So they'll become true or false in due course. So Aristotle is sitting in the Parthenon, looking out over the Aegean Sea. He sees, the Spartan fleet and the Athenian fleet. Will they fight tomorrow? Well, tomorrow we'll find out. Okay. So by the end of tomorrow, it will either be true or false that there was a sea battle tomorrow. But now it's undetermined. So now it's neither true nor false. So the idea that there can be truth value gaps is as old as the history of logic itself in the West. The thought that there can be truth value gluts, dialetheas, is a much more recent view. And of course, a natural question is, well, what? I've given you an example of a sea battle, but what kind of creature might live down here? So, I'll talk about that when we get down here, all right? I'll give you some examples of plausible candidates. But let me talk a little bit more about dialetheism itself before we get to these things. Paraconsistency is the orthodox view in the history of logic. Okay? And I've explained it's only become exploded, has only become orthodox in the last 100 years. The situation is quite different with respect to dialetheism, because there have been very few dialetheists in the history of Western philosophy until the late 20th century. Arguably there have been some. Arguably Hegel was. But this is very, very much a minority view in the history of metaphysics. Because orthodox Western philosophy has endorsed the principle of non-contradiction. And the principle of non-contradiction is exact that in an actual situation there is nothing in this quadrant. Nothing can be true and false. So, since this is such an orthodox view, you might think there are good arguments for it. So what arguments are there? Well, if you ask any modern logician why you should subscribe to the law of non-contradiction, they will tell you that if a contradiction is true, everything is true. And it's clear that it's not the case that everything is true. So they will appeal to explosion. All right? Obviously, that argument just begs the question in this context, because it just rules out the possibility by fiat. Because in a paraconsistent logic, that argument from explosion does not work. However, that was not the traditional reason for the law of non-contradiction. It couldn't be, because paraconsistency is a relatively modern view. Okay? So, why did people think that the law of non-contradiction is true? Well, it's an amazing fact that in the history of Western logic, there is, as far as I know, only one sustained argument for the principle of non-contradiction. It was given by Aristotle, and in Book Gamma of the Metaphysics, he has a chapter and a half where he gives arguments for the principle of non-contradiction. And it must be said that these arguments are terrible. So there is one very long argument, okay? And commentators cannot even agree on how it's meant to work, let alone that it works. And then there are a number of small arguments, 5 or 6 depending how you cut them up, which are pretty clearly beside the point. Because Aristotle says, I'm going to show you that no contradictions are true, but these other arguments defend something else. Namely, the view that it's not possible for all contradictions to be true. So even if these arguments are successful, they don't show you that the principle of non-contradiction is true. They show you the principle of non-triviality is true, right? Of course, it's quite compatible with the fact that not all contradictions are true, that some are. So a lot of Aristotle's arguments are clearly beside the point. And in fact, this is not news. There was a beautiful book written by the Polish logician Łukasiewicz in 1910, where he analyses Aristotle's arguments, and it's just a beautiful piece of writing. He just shows that the arguments do not work. So it's not just my view that the arguments are terrible, but most people now think that they're wrong. So an interesting view is why people have been so fond of the principle of non-contradiction in the history of Western philosophy. I mean, after all, everything else that Aristotle said has been rejected, or at least deeply problematized. And it's really not until the last 50 years or so that the principle of non-contradiction has been problematized by modern dialethists. So, in a sense, the principle of non-contradiction is the last bastion of Aristotelianism, which is now falling. Okay, so you cannot, if you're attacking dialethism, you cannot appeal to Aristotle, you cannot appeal to explosion. What else can you appeal to? What other good arguments are there? Well, it's very hard to find good arguments. And maybe you can think of some. Maybe you want to share some with me. But let me just mention one more, and then we'll pass on to something else. So, this concerns rationality. So the thought is that rationality presupposes consistency. For the following reason. Suppose that, let me give you an example. Suppose that I believe in God, okay? And someone comes up with an argument against the existence of God. God does not exist. And I say, oh yeah, I like that argument, God doesn't exist. But of course God exists. And you say, well, you're being a bit naughty here. Rationality requires that you cannot believe that God both exists and does not exist. Okay? So the thought is that if you can accept a contradiction, this just ruins rationality, in particular rational criticism, rational change of belief. Okay? And that sounds like a pretty good argument. If you at first, it's better than the other arguments. But it's actually not a very good argument. For the following reason. Many people have irrational views that are perfectly consistent. So, there are some people who think that the Earth is flat. Okay? And some are just joking, of course. But there are some people who seriously believe this. And if you start to argue with them, you say, well, if the Earth was flat, then the water would sort of fall off the end. They say, no, well, it doesn't work like that because gravity changes at the edges. And you say, well, we've been up in space and we've seen that the Earth is round. And they say, well, no, we haven't really been up in space because there really have been no space missions. It's just propaganda put out by the CIA. Okay, so, I mean, when you argue with these people, you discover that their views are perfectly consistent. But they're crazy for all that, right? It's irrational to believe that the Earth is flat. Oh dear, I hope there are no flat earthers in the room. So your views can be consistent yet completely irrational. Why? Because there are many criteria of rationality other than consistency. So for example, what is wrong with flat earthers is that all the time they appeal to ad hoc hypotheses to defend their views. So there are many criteria on rationality independently of consistency. And it may well be the case that if you have a very good theory of something that is inconsistent, it's still the best theory, even though it's inconsistent, because all the other theories have these other methodological flaws, like they're ad hoc, they don't explain the data very well, and so on. So, in the case that I gave you, so I believe in the existence of God, someone comes along and says, gives me a proof that God doesn't exist, I say, well, okay, God doesn't exist, but God still exists. That's entirely ad hoc, right? And that's why it's intellectually shonky, bad, irrational move. But that doesn't mean that all inconsistent beliefs are intellectually irrational. So later on, we may get around to talking about truth and the paradox of self-reference. And here the view that truth is inconsistent because of paradox of self-reference is exceptionally well grounded by rational argument. We'll talk a little bit about what some of those are, perhaps. But you can summarise my main point at present like this. Let's agree that, in general, if a view is inconsistent, that's a sort of not good. But like all criteria, it's defeasible. So if your best theory about a subject tells you that some subject matter is inconsistent, that's what you should believe. I mean, after all, David Hume said, the wise person is a person who apportions their views to the evidence. And if your evidence tells you that something really is contradictory, then that's exactly what you should believe. So, rational views do not have to be consistent if they're better views than any other consistent view. And of course you may say, well, are there such things? We'll come to discuss that. But accepting the possible, making it possible to accept contradictions does not ruin rationality. It's just makes life a bit more difficult. But then, you know, rationality was never an easy topic anyway. Okay. So, all right. I think that's all I wanted to say about dialechism as such. Let's let me pause a second. Do you want to raise any questions or issues about any of that?
Okay, we spoke earlier about nominalism and realism. So I want to tackle this in a different way. You said that dialechism is a theory about metaphysics or about semantics, right? So let's say that metaphysics is a theory about objects or not. Dialechism, for dialechism to be a theory about metaphysics, don't you need something else aside from the unity of truth, which regards that there are true contradictions? Don't you also need a theory of truth? Because you said earlier that you don't, right?
Yeah.